Welcome to the Author Roundup. This special segment of the Book Connection show features up-and-coming indie authors who sit down with us and talk about their recently released books. Join us as we chat with our next guest author. Hi there, welcome to Author Roundup. I hope you are doing well. As always, my name is Emma, and I will be your host for today's episode. I am joined by author Dawn Kammer. Dawn was raised in Southern California, has taught high school and English as a second language in California and China. He is also a retired U.S. Army chaplain. Today, he serves as an institutional chaplain and teaches church history at Ascent College. He has completed degrees from Nelson College, Missouri State University, Assemblies of God Seminary, and the College of William and Mary. His PhD is in theology with an emphasis in global Christianity from Regent University. His book is called The Full Gospel Assembly of Washington, D.C., 1907 to 1934. Dawn, welcome to the show. How are you today?
It's good to be here. I'm great.
Awesome. Congrats on publishing your book, first and foremost. Is this your first book?
This is my first book. I've written a few other things, but this is the first book.
First published book. Nice. Well, can you share a little bit about your book with our audience today?
Okay, so the book, Full Gospel Assembly, is a story of a community in Washington, D.C. that became a church as a result of influence from the Azusa Street revival and mission in 1906, 1907. It's a fascinating story with ups and downs, and kind of an oppositional story because there was opposition against the church. But the pastor, Harry Lee Collier, was able to navigate the church to really a very influential success in the nation's capital.
Okay. And so you mentioned that it is a story. So is it more, so it has like religious and researched aspects of it, but ultimately you're saying it's like a story, so a storytelling aspect in a book?
Well, it's really a local church history, but with a focus on the theology of Pentecostalism. I discussed that a little bit and some of the issues that are taking place today. You know, one of the difficulties right now is defining what Pentecostalism is because it's become so large. Some people are saying it's perhaps the third tradition in Christianity. Hundreds of millions of people are Pentecostals, charismatics today. And so this church is just one of the early churches in the United States that had a very innovative approach to its ministry in the nation's capital.
Okay. And so can you go a little bit more into how the 1906 earthquake of Pentecostalism at the Azusa Street Mission like sparked the formation in Washington, D.C., which is so interesting?
Sure. So in 1906, there was a Black preacher who wound up in Los Angeles, and he believed in the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And through his ministry, a revival began in the city, and it was attacked viciously by the media. And yet, for the next few years, thousands of people came through, and it sparked a tradition in the United States and influenced churches in the United States, which today we call Pentecostals or classical Pentecostals. These churches are like the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee, the Assemblies of God, Foursquare, many churches, the Church of God in Christ, many denominations reflect that tradition today. And in the broader world Christianity, these churches are exploding everywhere. You look at South America, you look at Africa, hundreds of millions of Pentecostals exist today.
Yeah. Okay. And so the creation of Full Gospel Assembly began when a group of women acted on reports from the Azusa Street Mission's newspaper. So how did these women contribute to the early Pentecostal movement in DC, and what was their lasting impact?
Well, first of all, they were really seeking God, and
Mm-hmm.
they heard reports about the move of God in Los Angeles. And one of the things that the church in Los Angeles did, this Azusa Street Mission, is that they
Mm-hmm.
had a newspaper that was issued.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to show you
Oh, perfect.
just briefly. You can buy this somewhere.
Oh
I
my
don't know
God.
where it is, but it's basically
Oh, wow.
it's an old copy. It's a copy of old newspapers. Well, these ladies were reading this, and they became hungry for God. And so they
Mm-hmm.
began to pray for revival in Washington, D.C. And in 1907, this happened when many of
Mm-hmm.
them were able to encounter the Holy Spirit. That encounter is called the baptism in the Holy Spirit. Miraculous things took place. And soon after that, persecution took place. And so it was kind of an interesting thing. And for several years, a home meeting took place, a series of meetings in the city took place,
Mm-hmm.
until one day an itinerant preacher gave up because the group was small,
Okay.
and he gave the keys over to a former Baptist named Harry Lee Collier. And Harry Lee Collier was a government worker, a federal government worker. He took the church, and with his leadership capability and his ministry and his commitment to spirit baptism, he led the church to be perhaps one of the most influential
Mm-hmm.
Pentecostal charismatic churches on the East Coast. And it's a fascinating story that went, and I tell the story until his death, but it went from 1907 to 1934.
Yeah. And so, what were some of the, I mean, you talked about it briefly, but what are some of the other challenges the Full Gospel Assembly faced in its development? I guess, particularly regarding the perception of Pentecostalism, and you mentioned the charismatic Christianity during that time.
Oh, yes, holy rollers. My father, I remember whenever he watched television, if he ever saw a preacher, he would say, "Turn that holy roller off."
Holy
I
roll.
come from a different tradition.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that these Christians that had this experience of the Spirit were often teased and mocked and called names. And
Mm.
one of the things also that happened that is quite visible when you study American newspapers, a lot of newspapers held very negative information about this tradition and this movement.
Oh, wow.
And so one of the things I do specifically in my book is I
Mm-hmm.
look at the Washington, D.C. press, and I look at
Oh,
what they printed about this Christian tradition, and I
yeah.
talk about it. And a lot of it is negative. There's a few positive elements.
Okay.
When Harry Lee Collier comes into the position of pastoring the church in Washington, D.C., eventually that rhetoric disappears. And in 1927, the Evening Star and the Washington Post are publishing
Mm-hmm.
very positive newspaper articles about this unique church,
Okay.
describing its success. And also in 1927, describing the fact that these kind of churches point to the future. I don't think they
Mhm.
realized what they were saying. But in
Yeah.
truth, the Pentecostal charismatic movement has
Mhm.
phenomenally exploded across the globe. And these newspapers, in some way, were very prophetic, even though
Mhm.
they didn't know they were prophetic.
Yeah. And so what was it about the misconceptions or negativity in American newspapers about these sort of topics? Was it just misinformation? Not a lot of people like know about it. And then what prompted the shift of more positive words being written about this particular subject, do you think?
It's actually a mixed bag.
Okay.
So, in one sense, some of these Pentecostals were immature
Okay.
and they did things a little enthusiastically, and that often caught notice.
Okay.
I mean, people often were fearful and afraid of strange things happening, and these
New.
Pentecostals were claiming miracles, and there
Okay.
were miracles.
Mm-hmm.
Also some things that weren't miracles. You know, some of them even handled snakes. Now, that wasn't the norm and wasn't something that was encouraged, but some of them handled snakes and they believed that God would protect them. But unfortunately, the newspaper reports and report in several occasions that people died. Some individuals believed in healing, and of course,
Mm-hmm.
Christians throughout history have believed in healing. But if you stop your medical treatment and then your child dies, that gets into the newspaper. And so a lot of reports of craziness took place. There was also prejudice against women. So one
Mm-hmm.
of the things that happened commonly was that these Pentecostals had women preachers, female preachers. Some of the most significant individuals of the era, like Amy Semple McPherson, who was a very popular preacher, Edith May Pennington, who one newspaper evaluated that she was the most beautiful woman in America. These people became preachers and they came to Washington, D.C. And they were hosted by Pastor Collier, and they often used other venues. In fact, one occasion, thousands of people were waiting outside of a venue in Washington, D.C., trying to get in to
Oh,
hear
wow.
Amy
Mm-hmm.
Semple McPherson. And no one could get in, just very few could get in. 5,000 in the auditorium.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the kind of things that happened. You have this negative reporting, and then you have other reporting that's not so negative.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a major obstacle, I think,
Yeah.
for this church able to be successful in spite of the negative reporting in the Washington, D.C. papers movement. One of the
Mm-hmm.
interesting things is that the Washington, D.C. papers actually had one very positive article, which came out in 1907, which was quite interesting from my perspective.
Oh, yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
there's a mixture of things taking place here in terms of the press. And so I
Okay.
show that the church was able to navigate that challenge
Mm-hmm.
in such a way that it actually did become a successful church in the city. Now, one of the reasons why it might have been successful is that Harry Lee Collier's son, Rex Collier, became a very important newspaper reporter in DC,
Oh, okay.
working for both the Evening Star and the Washington Post.
Oh,
He
wow.
was an editor also. So you might say that his son could have influenced the media in
Mm-hmm.
Washington, D.C. to be less critical than it was in many places in the United States.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's interesting. And so the full gospel assembly is described as an example of early Pentecostal and evangelistic fusion. How could you elaborate on how these two movements were like blended and what fusion looked like in the practice itself of each?
So I use the term evangelistic instead of evangelical,
Okay.
even though very early Harry Lee Collier mentioned his church as being both Pentecostal and evangelical, but mostly the term evangelistic was used. And
Mm, okay.
so in the United States, there are different kinds of Pentecostal communities that began to appear. The initial communities were very holiness oriented, and holiness oriented in terms of churches like the Wesleyan Holiness Church, the Nazarenes, where
Mhm.
the holiness theology of the era was very important. Collier, on the other hand, had kind of a more Baptistic perspective, reflecting the Assemblies of God theology, and he was very effective in helping his church relate to the city. So you might call him ecumenical, but many of the holiness churches were more rural oriented. So their
Mm-hmm.
style was kind of a more rural orientation. But
Mm-hmm.
Collier's church really tried to fit into Washington, D.C. And so
Mm-hmm.
it often had a liturgy. It would advertise communion in the newspapers.
Oh, wow.
In that sense, it was appealing to people that were comfortable in Methodist kind of environment. And that's one of the things that I think that marks Full Gospel Assembly as a little bit different from many of the other Pentecostal charismatic churches that existed in
Mm.
the era. It was not very critical of your mainline religious experience. In fact, it tried to reach them.
Okay. And so, as far as I know, you mentioned a little bit about like the newspaper coverage and things like that. How did the Full Gospel Assembly influence the surrounding community in DC at the time in its early years?
That's an excellent question. Pentecostals historically are known for evangelism, reaching out
Mhm.
to others. And Collier's church planted churches all over the region. In
Okay.
fact, in the Assemblies of God, which Collier was an Assemblies of God minister, although his church was kept independent, Collier himself, through his church, helped establish numerous Assemblies of God churches in the region. It's quite fascinating how many he did. And it's sad
Mm.
that often when you have churches like this in the Pentecostal charismatic movement, we forget them because Pentecostals don't really write well and haven't academic histories of their local churches. And they should.
Oh,
They should not forget the past because the past
right.
is very important.
Okay. And so, how many churches are you saying in the region as far as?
I would say probably they've influenced they during the period of time which I'm talking about
Yeah.
probably 20 churches and communities
Okay.
spun out of Full Gospel Assembly.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that later those churches would probably replicate too. So
Mm-hmm.
the Collier's church had a major influence in this region for the Assemblies of God that is quite remarkable for any church. Another thing that it did, it didn't only have churches, but it had individuals that were nurtured in this church and went on to different places. For example, the historian, one of the early historians of the Assemblies of God, a man named Brumbach, he was he was raised in this church and he went on to be a pastor and a significant leader. But there were many others also that were influenced and went into missions, went into other regions that made impact in the Assemblies of God at different times and different places.
And so you mentioned earlier about holy rollers, and your book also mentions tongue talkers, right? Is
Yes.
that right? So Pentecostals were often labeled this during this period, like you mentioned. How did the Full Gospel Assembly, I guess, navigate these popular misconceptions, and how did it affect the church's reputation? Did it affect it a lot, or just a little, or how did that go about?
And this is an important subject because the culture during this period was prone to giving slurs. And
Yeah.
so the term holy roller, it didn't start with Pentecostals. It actually started
Oh,
applied to the holiness tradition. But eventually the Pentecostals assumed that that phrase because most of the early Pentecostals were from the holiness tradition. Not all,
okay.
but most of them were. And within a few years, Lutherans and Baptists and people from many different church traditions became Pentecostals. And
Okay.
so as time went on, the percentage of Pentecostals became fewer and fewer holiness background. For example, Collier. Collier had a Baptist background. but his
Oh,
mother
okay.
had a holiness background. So you can see it gets fairly difficult. And
Hmm.
when you look at newspapers across the country, they would often use these words: holy roller, holy jerker,
And newspapers.
holy jerker,
Wow.
different kinds of terms they would use, tongues
Mhm.
talkers. All of it was used in a negative way to pigeonhole that community.
Yeah.
Collier never really embraced the term holy roller. He just preached the gospel and was successful in ministry and
Hmm.
care pastorally. He did some very unique things. One of the interesting things that the Pentecostals do have a tradition of pacifism. The Pentecostals were not originally all pacifist, but many of them were pacifist. And in World War I, some of the churches actually adopted a pacifist theology, even though many of the people were not pacifist and served in the military. Collier, uniquely in Washington, D.C., had a lot of military people in his church.
Mhm.
He had
Okay.
band members that were military. He had family members of generals that attended the church. And the Full Gospel Assembly actually had a measure of decorum. So some of the really wild, crazy stuff that motivated the criticism in other
Hmm.
parts of the country,
Hmm.
Collier's church would minimize that. So Collier had this idea that you could, for the sake of the worship service, limit some of the strange stuff that other people thought was strange. And he wasn't the only one to do this. Amy Semple McPherson did this also. When she had her crusades or her ministry evangelistic engagements, often she would not allow people to come up and give prophecy or speak in tongues because it disrupted the service. And that's kind of the perspective that Collier had.
Oh yeah. Okay. So that's very interesting. So they didn't give in to the disruption and the misconceptions like people may have wanted them to, right? So they were there, to have service. And so they didn't want to give into that, which is so that's really interesting.
Yeah, Collier was very wise and I would say extremely aware of his environment. So
Mm-hmm.
he developed and modeled his church in a way that would attract the residents of DC. And
Mm.
the media material that was put out by Collier in the DC papers also appealed to the people in DC. So I
Mm.
think that he was quite a success in terms of making the Pentecostal charismatic tradition
Mm-hmm.
able to penetrate the historic kind of religious tradition that existed in DC. It was quite remarkable what he was able to do.
And did he ever speak with newspapers that you're aware of? Like, did he ever you know, be interviewed by newspapers, or was he like, "No, I'm not"?
Yes, he was. So,
Okay.
for example, when Amy Semple McPherson came to Washington, D.C. in 1927, Collier was the one that navigated the media and did the
Okay.
press releases.
Oh, wow.
Collier also, on two other occasions, had an encounter with the media. One, there was a member of the church who worked for the War Department, and a submarine sank off Nantucket, and the man died. Collier officiated the funeral at Full Gospel Assembly and also at Arlington, where he was assisted by a Navy chaplain.
Mm.
So he engaged the community quite effectively. And
Yeah.
part of the reason for this is that he had been a federal government worker. And he was a senior federal government worker. He was the deputy comptroller for the Department of the Interior. And when he
Mm.
resigned, the secretary of the department wrote an article or commented to the reporter that he would be missed and that he was personally sad that Collier had stepped down to pastor his church full time. So,
Hmm.
and this is one of the very unique aspects about Collier. I doubt that anywhere in the United States you had a Pentecostal leader with such capacity to relate to this tier of government
Yeah, that's so
presence.
interesting. Yeah. And when did he pass away?
He died in 1934. He had had a stroke before that and had become a little weak,
Mm.
but in 1934 he died, and the church went on to be pastored by another individual called Mahan. And within
Mm.
1 year, the church became an Assemblies of God church. So it joined the Assemblies of God.
So there is a part that about your book that is really interesting. You mention in your book that the Full Gospel Assembly held meetings on Electric Street railroad lines and theaters and parlor houses. What made these unconventional spaces significant for the growth of the church?
So this is before the church officially had been established.
Okay.
And this is another fascinating story. So the church is connected to these women that we spoke about earlier. These women
Yeah.
were reading the Azusa Street newspaper,
Hmm.
and they were seeking the baptism in the Holy Spirit. And they heard that there was a church in Washington, D.C., pastored by a woman named Sarah Thomas, a black woman, a young black woman pastoring a Pentecostal church. And they went to this church, and some of them were filled with the Holy Spirit. And after that, a itinerant preacher named Stone set up a mission on H Street. Now, H Street was a great location for a mission because it had the electric trolley line. People could just
Oh, okay.
go by and get off and go to the mission. And
Yeah.
so for a short while, a mission existed. And eventually, though, they didn't have enough money, and that preacher quit being a Pentecostal. And so they went to a home on H Street, and
Oh,
the home was Mary Perry's home. And for several years, they had Pentecostal services in that home. And eventually,
wow.
itinerant preachers came by, and they began to lead that small group. And they moved it down by the morgue, probably the worst place in D.C. you can imagine, the other side of the railroad tracks. And they tried to build the church there. And in
Oh.
1915, the the leader of that itinerant ministry decided to quit and gave the
Oh.
key to Harry Lee Collier, who was the manager of finances. And
Uh-huh.
Collier took the church and led it. And from
Yeah.
there, it moved from place to place to place, and quite successfully impacting the city.
Oh, wow. That's so interesting. How it just like kind of went into someone's home. Like, wow, that's so cool. So you mentioned in your book that some feel that the Full Gospel Assembly's history has been largely neglected. What drew you to this research or what drew you to research this church, and what were some of the most surprising and interesting discoveries you made during your research? And how long have you been researching this?
So I was an Army chaplain, and I
Yeah.
retired in
Mhm.
in 2014. Sorry, Army chaplain retiring in 2014.
Gotcha.
And I followed my wife's job. She was a federal government worker. She moved her employment to Washington, D.C. And we
Okay.
decided to settle first for 1 year to figure out where we wanted to live in DC. So we moved to a place that was 1 block from her job. But right near there was National Public Radio also.
Oh,
So National Public Radio. And interestingly, there was an old dilapidated brick church that was 2 blocks away, North Capitol and K Street. And I had walked by this church several times. And I noticed one Sunday there was a church service there. It was a Spanish group renting the facility. And I went in and looked. And so I decided to look it up, and I found out that it had been once an Assemblies of God church.
Oh my
And
God.
I was actually, was not satisfied with, so at that time I was in a doctoral program, and
Okay.
I was going to write on the chaplaincy, but I wanted to do something to help the church, help
Okay.
the broader Christian community. And I began to study this church from 2000, so from 2014 I began to study the church. And I
Wow.
learned that it had a remarkable history. And so I changed my dissertation topic. And eventually I pulled in all of the resources. I found primary source material in archives, and I
Hmm.
decided to write the story of the church. And one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book is because one of the weaknesses in the Pentecostal tradition, in the Assemblies of God, is we do not write about the history of our older churches. In fact, some of the great churches of the movement, Glad Tidings, New York, the Stone Church in Chicago, there are not good academic histories of those early churches. But not only in the Assemblies of God, your other Pentecostal denominations, they don't write church histories. And around the world, there's fascinating churches in Germany that need a history. Churches in
Hmm.
West Berlin called the Jesus Center, fascinating history. Churches in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and in Latin America and Africa. We haven't been writing the history of our churches. Of course, we write about celebrities,
Hmm.
celebrity preachers. We write about our pet theologies. Okay, we have a lot of theology written. We write about our denominations, but the local churches have been ignored. And if we
Mm.
don't write local church histories, we will forget what
Yeah.
people did, what they heroically did, despite persecution, despite opposition. And we should not forget the story of these people. And so I was motivated to write about this church because it has simply a fascinating
Hmm.
history and a fascinating story. And it's important for the tradition, it's important for the Pentecostal and charismatic movement to
Yeah.
understand something about their local churches.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that you did. It's so interesting that you moved to DC and then stumbled upon this church and then here you are and then you wrote a book. And so how is your research process then? Since there wasn't much research about these local churches, did you have to get creative? Did you go like on site to like certain locations? Did you interview people? What was that like for you?
Well, there's no one alive that I
Right.
can
Yeah.
talk to, and that's a good thing in a way.
Yeah.
But I will say that I became intrigued about local church histories,
Hmm.
and I discovered that mainline denominations have local church histories. They have a lot of them in DC, but traditionally, Pentecostal charismatic groups have not done church history. And why is that? Some people have said it's because we're so busy doing the work of ministry that we have no time for local church history. And that's really a tragedy. It's a
Yeah.
tragedy to think
Unfortunate.
that way. I think
Yeah.
that we just haven't engaged in it because we just haven't devoted the time. I think it's important to devote the time. And so
Hmm.
I decided to do this history for that reason, to tell a story that we need to know. It's like today, everyone tries to find out where they came from. What's
Right.
my family DNA?
Hmm.
Who's been in my family in the past that made contributions? Well, in the Potomac network of the Assemblies of God, this church is probably the most important church there is. And one of the reasons I wrote it is I wanted to do a service and help my community to understand that we have a fascinating legacy. And it's not only my legacy, it's also the legacy of the broader church. It's not just
Hmm.
Pentecostals. It's
Right.
entire Christianity needs to hear about their local churches.
And so your book came out this year. What made you want to get the word out about this subject as far as publication? I know you said that you wrote your dissertation on this, but what made you actually like want to seek publishing?
I wanted to tell a story about
Yeah.
the church, but also in this story, there's some very interesting elements. There's people, there's individuals, and I found some, fascinating quotes that I include in there. But, Harry Lee Collier, for example, he used to work at Woody's, which is Woodward and Lathrop's, which is a classical Washington, D.C. store. And he was a friend of Mr. Woodard. And
Mhm.
and I think throughout their life they had a relationship. I wish I could find more information on that, but
Mhm.
they attended the same church for a while, the Baptist church. And Collier got sick one day. He had eczema all across his body. It was a major problem. And he believed in healing, but he didn't get healed. So
Mhm.
he went off to a meeting of Pentecostals and he asked for them to pray for him. And lo and behold, he got healed. Now, of course, everybody doesn't get healed, you know, at the moment they get prayed for, but Collier was
Mhm.
healed. And that is what attracted him to
Oh, wow.
the tradition, the full gospel or Pentecostal tradition. And so he joined a church that his mom was going to. Now, that's not the only story. There's another story. There's a fellow called Herbert Klein who became the superintendent of the Assemblies of God for the Potomac Network. And Klein was the gospel mission leader in Washington D.C. for many years. He wasn't
Mhm.
Pentecostal. He kind of looked at them humorously, and he kept having a lady who was the janitor come into his apartment, come into his office and tell him, I pray for you every day. I pray for you every day. And he called her Sophie the Scrub Woman, which is interesting. But Sophie kept inviting him to go down by the morgue. It was a terrible place, by the way. The morgue in DC smelled during those days. But the mission,
Mhm.
the full gospel mission at the time was by the morgue. And Sophie the Scrub Woman kept telling him, come down there and see the gospel service down there. And eventually he went down there and he found his wife there and he found Harry Collier and he began to be associated with the Pentecostal tradition through that experience. And then there's another guy, which is a very interesting fellow. This man's name is Thomas Hewson. Thomas Hewson. And Thomas was the secretariat for the Bird expedition. So the Bird polar expedition, he was
Oh,
responsible
wow.
for supplies. He went to this church. And on one occasion, he is working on a ship, so he's a mariner, and he
Mhm.
goes off to Australia to preach the gospel as a missionary from Full Gospel Assembly. And on his way, he goes to Pitcairn Island, where the mutineers from the Bounty had settled. And there in Pitcairn Island, he gets off the ship and he preaches, and they ask him to be the king, the sovereign. That's what the Washington Post says. And he said, "Well, I can't do that, but I gave all my books, all my Bibles, and everything to them, and we departed." So they're very interesting
It
stories
is.
coming.
Yeah. So yeah, I like that aspect of your book that it's has personal elements and relationships because these were people and the storytelling aspect of it. So how that makes me think of my next question is how is like your book outlined, I guess? Like what's the flow of your book? Since it is like there's parts of like stories in it, and how did you go about as a writer portraying these stories and being the person to get the stories of these people out there? What was that like for you?
That's a good question. So my book is intended not only to tell the story of Full Gospel Assembly,
Mhm.
I also wanted to deal with theological issues. So,
Okay.
for example, the idea of Pentecostalism, the
Mhm.
words full gospel,
Mhm.
Assemblies of God, Church of
Mhm.
God, these are terms that need defining. And
Mhm.
so I wanted to talk about how the word Pentecostal is defined today and also discuss a debate that continues.
Mm-hmm.
because that term still is not completely defined. And there are arguments that are ongoing. And I wanted to present these. I also wanted to present this discussion that was taking place in the newspapers and show the negative opposition to Pentecostals, and at the same time show that Full Gospel Assembly was able to overcome that
Mm-hmm.
negative rhetoric
Mm-hmm.
by being a successful church. I mean, they had at times thousands of people attending. Membership was over 1,000 in the heart of DC, and it attracted positive media attention. They held baptisms in the Potomac, which were actually pictures were printed in the newspapers. And so the church tried to achieve visibility through good use of the newspapers as much as possible. They also regularly published the events that would take place,
Yeah.
accounts of evangelists that would come in. You know, another interesting factor about this church in DC is that it had a lot of Canadians come. So some of the greatest
Mhm.
Canadian Pentecostal preachers of the era wound up in DC preaching at Full Gospel Assembly. It's quite fascinating.
Wow.
The DC leaders of the Canadian Pentecostal movement came and preached in the city and were actually quite popular.
Oh, wow. Why is that?
I don't know. Somebody needs to write a book on that.
About that specifically.
Somebody needs to write a book
Oh,
on the Canadians that flocked down to Washington, D.C.
yeah.
during the
Wow.
20s and 30s.
Wow. Okay, so when did you start writing a manuscript?
It was during my dissertation phase at Regent University. And after I did the dissertation, I needed to correct a lot of things. I'm sure there's some things I could still correct in the book, but I tried to clean up a lot of little errors and restructure a few things.
Okay. And how long did it take you to complete it?
I would say a few years,
Okay.
actually.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Wow.
And
And
you
so,
know, when you get older, it's harder. So
yeah,
getting older, like all of us, I encourage you, if you have a church that you want to write the history of, get
do it
involved
now.
right now. Start
Yeah.
saving finding the resources, finding the people to tell the story. Because
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, no one is alive to talk
Mm-hmm.
about this church right now.
Hmm.
And that's a tragedy. I do
Yeah.
have some testimonies that were made that were written,
Okay.
but today I wasn't able to find anybody that's a member of the
Mm.
church. Not even people still going to the church. I don't find any relatives there.
Oh,
And the church
wow.
now is not doing that well. Well, it just tells you churches have a life cycle.
Yeah, that's true. So this is your first book. Can you share some of your anecdotes of your writing experience, or like what was your writing routine like? What was your process like specifically for your research and how you went about things?
Well, for one thing, I know I'm not a naturally gifted writer. I know I have to force myself to sit in front of the computer.
Okay.
And I know that I'm prone to redundancies. So that's probably a weak point, I would say, that you need to focus on
Focus.
trying not to be redundant when you write. And I'm sure I have
Mhm.
redundancies in my book. You know, no book is perfect. So I can
No,
look at
no,
my
it's
book and
hard.
criticize it right now. But
Yeah.
write when you're young. That's what I would say.
That's a good one. So after this book, did you grow to enjoy writing, or did you have a difficult part of your writing process that, or did you like it more coming out of it, or
No, I like writing. I want to do more writing. I have
okay,
ideas that I want to write, but they're probably not related to this.
okay, to this.
They're different things that I've done in the past that I like to rework.
Okay.
Um,
Nice.
but you know, I want to write more, and I
Yeah,
will do it.
very cool. How was it writing these stories of all these incredible people? Did you enjoy the storytelling aspect of it? Because you're really good at telling the stories, and I'm sure that comes across in your writing as well.
I'll say Pentecostals have a lot of stories. The Pentecostal charismatic tradition reaches people often at the extremists. I mean, they're in terrible
Oh,
situations, or they're in
yeah.
strange situations. And as they encounter God, their life changes. And they they wind up becoming just fascinating stories of spiritual transformation. For example, Collier's story. And there's something I would like to write about in the Assemblies of God and Potomac Network. There's a fellow named Long, and he
Mhm.
became a leader, a district superintendent, and he has a history that he wrote. This guy used to be a prize boxer. He used to like box and fight people, and he
Oh
became a
my God.
cowboy. He went off to the West and was a cowboy for a few years. And then he worked on a railroad, and then eventually he got converted to Christianity. And he wound
Um,
up becoming a superintendent in the Potomac network of the Assemblies of God, which is quite a senior leader. So
yeah,
so
that's
someone
very,
needs to tell his story. But
yeah.
there's just so many stories out there. I really
Mhm.
think sadly I mentioned this before,
Mhm.
very important church in the Assemblies of God. It's
Mhm.
Glad Tidings Tabernacle in New York. And tragically, no one has written on it. Somebody needs to write that story. Needs to
Yeah.
tell the story of that church because it
Mhm.
was a missional church that had great, profound impact across the world.
And so you've mentioned a lot of incredible stories. Was there a part of your book that was the most memorable part to write that you haven't mentioned yet, or a favorite part of your book? And
That's a hard question. I think I mentioned that earlier when I mentioned Thomas Hewson and Collier. I found though, if there's any key aspect of Full Gospel Assembly that I should mention, it is the fact that this church and Harry Lee Collier were absolutely open to developing women in ministry and inviting women ministers to preach. Some of the greatest women evangelists of the era, people like Edith Mae Pennington, Amy Semple McPherson, came to this church and preached. And it attracted people to come to Full Gospel Assembly. In fact, on many occasions, Collier had to find other venues. And when he found these other venues, thousands of people waited outside because they wanted to hear these preachers. But it wasn't only the evangelists, and I only mentioned two, there were many others. The Argues from Canada came, Beulah Argue and others. But Collier used women to do ministry out of his church, and he helped develop women ministers and encourage them to go off to Bible college. And so I
wow.
think if there's anything that is absolutely remarkable about Collier's church is that he equipped and empowered and encouraged women preachers.
That's amazing. I love that. That's really incredible that he gave them a chance, I guess you could say, and empowered them like you mentioned.
They
So that's a
preached in
really
his pulpit. And another thing, he did not monopolize the pulpit. He had people preach in his congregation from his congregation often.
and so what would you say has been the nicest feedback or review you've received about your book? I know that it's freshly published, but what's been some feedback and some
I,
comments?
I would say the probably the most significant piece of feedback I had was from Cecil Robeck Jr., who wrote something that is included in the book. And Cecil basically said that my book is a very important contribution
Oh,
to
wow.
early Pentecostal history. I have to look to see what else he said here. Hold on.
Oh, yeah. You can read it if you want to.
Yeah. So, well, I could read it. I don't want to read it. I should be Cecil to read it. So, okay, here's so Cecil Robeck. I'm really honored that he
Mhm.
wrote a blurb, something
Yeah.
that's
Right.
included in the book. And he said that my book is groundbreaking, groundbreaking, my book is a groundbreaking piece of early Pentecostal history. And another thing that he said was that the book is very important for pastors to read, to
Wow.
understand how a church can be very effective and how a church can reach people in the midst of a climate that might have been negative and turn things
Mm.
around. And so I'm happy that Cecil Robeck, who, by the way, wrote this book, he wrote this book.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this is
Oh, very cool.
he wrote the Azusa Street Mission and Revival. So let me do this again. I'm very happy that Cecil Robeck, who wrote probably the most important book on the Azusa Street Mission and Revival, words about my book. I was very happy, very
Mm.
impressed. He said my book was groundbreaking, and he said that it's a must read for students and pastors to understand what happened during the early years of the Pentecostal tradition.
Wow, that's incredible. That's so awesome. And so you wrote a book. Have you taught? I know that you've taught, you're a teacher, you've had many years of education. Have you taught this specific subject, or do you wish to teach like this subject to students and people?
Yeah, I would love to teach this topic.
Yeah.
But right now, I'm teaching a one-course church history class at Ascent College, which I enjoy doing. But I'm sure in the future, I'm going to be able to teach on the Pentecostal charismatic movement. And
Yeah, that would be really,
I
really
think it's
cool.
important. I
Yeah.
am impressed with some of the books coming out. There's a lot of good books on that deal with Pentecostalism.
Mhm.
Generally, broader church histories have in the past covered Pentecostalism as a paragraph, but
Right.
there are some books today that are coming out written by some good scholars that understand the impact and significance of the Pentecostal charismatic tradition.
Mhm.
So when I teach about broader church history, I do deal with Pentecostalism because I think it's
Mhm.
important for
Yeah.
anyone to understand the broader history of Christianity.
Wow. And so are you happy with your choice of changing your dissertation? How has that decision impacted your life? You're an
So,
author?
so right. So when I was at William and Mary, my thesis was the dual nature of the chaplaincy, that we have multiple bosses. And I wanted to take that and carry it further to
Okay.
write a dissertation and do a book, but I changed my mind because
Right.
I had just spent a career with the chaplaincy and I wanted to do something
Do
new.
something else. Yeah.
And I decided to do something on church history
Yeah.
and the history of Pentecostalism
Mhm.
because I was very interested and I am fascinated by this topic. I find it
I
very,
can tell. Yeah.
yeah, very interesting and I'm enthusiastic about it.
Yeah.
I think
I
when you
love it.
get older, and which I am older, I'm in the 60s now, it's important to be enthusiastic about something that you write. And so
Yeah.
my enthusiasm was able to get me to this point. So if I'm going to thank anything, I'm going to thank my enthusiasm for this
Mhm.
topic because I think it's important. Otherwise, writing can be quite grueling. And so I'm just happy I was able to get through it.
Yeah. Well, that's perfect. That leads me into my next question, which is what advice would you give to a writer working on his or her first book?
I would say don't give up. You will feel like giving up many times, but don't give up. And when you feel that you've completed it, go over it again a few times to make sure you don't have any errors. That's probably the most important piece of advice I could give. Don't rush to get it published, but
Right.
go over it again to
Yeah.
make sure you cover everything.
And so what was the publishing process like for you? Was anything like surprising, or why self-publishing? What kind of got you into that side of publishing? And was there anything that you didn't anticipate?
You know, that's a good question because honestly, this is an academic book, and in
Mhm.
academia, you really want to try to publish more peer oriented.
Yeah.
My book is includes a significant portion of personal testimony.
Mm-hmm.
And also is I try to make it able for people to read that are not academics, even though it is quite academic. So I chose to go with self-publishing because I wanted to publish it in a way that I wanted it to be published. So
Right.
I wanted to put out what I put out.
Yeah.
I also wanted to reach out more to my network community, my
Mm,
denominational community, my tradition community
absolutely.
than an academic community. So in this case, I made the decision to
Mm-hmm.
self-publish.
Okay. Yeah, and it seemed like it was the right, choice for your book as far as your goals and what you wanted out of it. So,
Also,
um,
I'm very happy with the publishing company, Westbow Press. I'm
yeah.
happy with what they've done for me,
Mhm.
and that's a positive for them.
Yeah. So, what personal or professional book goals do you have for this year and the coming year? What do you got going on?
Well, I'm going to sit at a table with the books in a few venues and try to do another presentation. This year, I did a presentation on my church at the Washington, D.C. Historical Society.
Oh,
And so
wow.
next year, I'm also going to do a presentation, and I'm going to choose one of the individuals in my book to tell the story of. And at the same time, I want to also have a book table where I can market my book at the
Yeah.
Washington, D.C. Historical Society meeting.
Wow, that's cool.
So I'll
Um,
try to take advantage of everything I can, in
yeah.
terms of to market tell the story
Yeah.
of this church and Harry Lee Collier, and
Mhm.
also encourage others to write local church histories. So
Yeah.
probably the biggest thing that could happen from this book is that I encourage others to begin to tell the story and write and record the history of their church.
Right. Yeah, I think your book is great because it has so much history, but then yeah, that's also a goal of yours is to get people to talk about local church history. So you get kind of like two lessons there. So that's really cool. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today, Dawn. Do you have any other messages you'd wish to share with whoever is watching and listening?
Emma, I have no other messages. I just want to thank you for your interview, and
Yeah.
this has been a very enjoyable moment.
Oh, great. Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's such an interesting like subject. I've learned so much, but yeah, it's something that definitely needs to be talked about. And I appreciate you publishing your book and being the person to share all of these stories about these incredible individuals and the history of these local churches. So thank you so much. And if you wish to purchase Dawn's book, you can head to, like he mentioned, westbowpress.com. We have an online bookstore, or you can also, as always, purchase it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. And if you do, please give a review of Dawn's book. He would greatly appreciate that, and we would as well. So
Yeah,
thank you so
I want to
much.
say that too. Please give a
Yeah,
review of my book.
yes, please.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.